Hi everyone. So I've kind of stopped making videos on katanas for the time being, although I do have something to say, inspired by some of the comments on my previous katana videos. So here we are. As I would imagine all of you now know if you're watching this channel, I have done several comparisons of the katana with other swords and talking about the general kind of overview of things about the katana, and equally for the longsword. And really I'm just showing these to remind you of the two swords I'm talking about, the late medieval two-handed or hand-and-a-half sword from Europe below, and the late medieval and Renaissance period hand-and-a-half sword from Japan. They are not hugely different in length. The katana tends to have a slightly shorter blade. They tend to have similar length hilts. Clearly the medieval sword has two edges and a cross guard and a pommel, and the Japanese sword has a disc guard, doesn't have a pommel really, and has one edge. So let's put those down. So the thing I really want to say is that in the comments to the videos I've made before, some people seem to be under the impression that these were used in drastically different ways. Well, quite simply, that's not true. For anybody who studies European longsword systems, you will know that there are various different ways of using the longsword, but they share common features. There are similar guard positions, similar ways of cutting, of stepping, of the footwork, similar principles essentially to using a two-handed sword in Europe. Okay? Now if we look at Japan, and you can go and look on YouTube for Kenjutsu demonstrations, Kenjutsu katana drills, practice techniques and so on. There are equally a range of different styles in Japanese Kenjutsu, and they're not homogeneous, they're not all the same, but equally they share certain ways of principles of cutting, of stepping, of how to parry, and these kind of things. Now, what you have to remember whenever you're talking about the differences between the longsword and the katana, and clearly they look pretty different, but they are nevertheless a roughly similar length, hand and a half, that is you can use it two-handed or one-handed, sword. Okay? And any of these swords can cut, can thrust, can defend in various ways, maybe with the flat, maybe with the edge, maybe with the back. They're the only parts of the blade that you've got. They both have hand guards, and they're both balanced in a roughly similar way. They're not like an axe, they're not like a spear, they are swords, hand-and-a-half swords. And you know, people only have two arms, two legs, one head hopefully, and a torso. And there are only a certain numbers of ways of doing anything. Now, anybody who studies either Kenjutsu or European longsword, when they look at the other, so when I look at Kenjutsu, or when a Kenjutsu person looks at European longsword, we see loads of similarity. Okay? There's many guard positions that are very, very similar. There's ways of stepping, of moving that are very similar. There's ways of crossing the blade, of blade engagements, and what you do from that blade engagement that are very similar, sometimes exactly the same. And incidentally, this is not just something limited to the swords. For those of us who study defense against dagger, as I do in Fiore, or dagger against dagger fighting, or wrestling, you can see the same techniques in East and West. Okay? If you look at Fiore or Talhofer or Palascal or various other German medieval manuals that involve dagger or wrestling or longsword, you can find exactly the same techniques, or in some cases almost exactly the same techniques, in Japanese martial arts, either in Aikido, Jiu-Jitsu, Kenjutsu, Bujinkan, Ninjutsu, wherever. So the fact is that when you're talking about these differences, the differences are really interesting, and I've been focusing on the differences in my videos because differences are usually the most interesting thing to talk about. But always remember that there are loads and loads of similarities, because there's only a certain number of ways that you can use a hand-and-a-half sword of about that long with the two arms and the two legs that you have. to either stab or cut. Okay? And there are only certain ways that you can defend, and there are only a certain number of ways you can step. So that's all I want to say really. There are actually a lot of similarities between European longsword and Japanese Kenjutsu, and please don't talk about either one or the other in mystical terms, that somehow they had a secret science that no one else had thought of, because actually anybody out there who does Kenjutsu will agree with this, and anybody out there doing European longsword will agree with this. There are loads of similarities. Thank you.